Hey guys, welcome to the Dill Pickle Movie Network. I am Dylan Randazzo. We are in the midst, almost coming to the end of my 2014 retrospective, where I am taking films from 10 years ago and looking at them in a modern lens 10 years later to see how they've held up and discovering some favorites that I might not have known about 10 years ago when I was checking out these films for the first time. And these films are very interesting. It is the second year of A24, 2014. The first year only had 5 films. I covered those in last year's retrospective, which was A Glimpse Inside the Mind of Charles Swan III, Ginger and Rosa, Spring Breakers, The Bling Ring, and The Spectacular Now. This year, they really just upped their slate, upped their ante. I mean, there were 11 films that A24 put out in 2014, so I figured why not continue along with this video series every single year and kind of check in on what A24 was doing 10 years ago, especially seeing how much they've grown now with a Best Picture win in Moonlight, another Best Picture win in Everything Ever All at Once, maybe another Best Picture win in a few months with Sing Sing, but really just looking at how much they've grown to see kind of their roots. This is still the very early kind of onset of A24 and seeing them really still hone in on the experimental aspect of A24, finding so many different genres to play with, big stars in smaller, more niche roles that are maybe unconventional for their types, which has been really cool to see, especially 10 years later, and see some stars that wouldn't blow up until a few years later, kind of getting their origins here and their starts here. A few examples, which we'll bring up in just a bit. But the 11 films that we will be covering are Enemy, Under the Skin, Locke, Obvious Child, The Rover, Life After Beth, Tusk, Laggies, Revenge of the Green Dragons, The Captive, and A Most Violent Year. So a lot of films to get to. Not going to spend a ton of time on each one, but I just want to tell you a little bit about them and what I think of them. Starting with the one that I was probably the most familiar with going into this video, which is Enemy by Denis Villeneuve. Denis Villeneuve obviously made such a big name for himself lately with the Dune movies and, of course, Blade Runner 2049, Arrival. But I think a lot of people kind of gloss over his really early work, even before Sicario, even before Prisoners. Enemy is one of those very fascinating films that feels very akin to Denis Villeneuve's style. It's very abstract. It's got some really interesting use of color, memorable images, but it still feels so small in nature to everything else he would do, which makes it such a refreshing film to keep coming back to time and time again. It tells a story about a college professor that kind of discovers that he has a lookalike after watching a movie, which, first off, the inciting incident is very odd. The guy goes, "Do you watch movies?" And he's like, not really. What are movies? This kind of weird question. I'm like, what are movies? Are you living under a rock?
You don't go to the movies, do you? I don't go out that much.
Anyway, that's the only complaint I've ever had about the film, is that it's a little weird that this guy just has never really watched a movie, or he says that he really doesn't watch movies. I don't know. I feel like it's just something with our culture. I feel like movies are on all the time, but I'm a movie buff. So anyway, that's a very, very small little nitpick, but it's about this guy who watches this movie and sees his doppelganger and kind of goes on a hunt to find him. And then when they meet, how that kind of transpires and what that does to their own personal lives. It has a greater thing to say about masculinity, specifically like toxic masculinity and relationships to one's parents, and how that reflects who we are, and just our own assessing of ourselves, which is just so fascinating. And I think there's some very abstract things going on here. I think this is definitely not one of the more accessible Denis Villeneuve films, but it is one that I always consistently love to come back, because I quite literally love the spider web that Denis Villeneuve weaves throughout this film of kind of finding these things to grab onto that we think we can grasp, we think we can wrap our heads around, then completely kind of weaving it the other way when we least expect it, and kind of giving us something new to chew on. So by the end, when it just hits us with the credits, it's like, wait, what did I just watch? And I love the movies that do that, the ones that kind of just keep our minds spinning, but never feel like they're not earned either. I feel like every moment in Enemy is earned, even if it's not completely predictable or satisfying. And that's the difference between this movie and a couple other movies, because I'll be honest, this slate of movies, A24, year two, not their finest year. But I think Enemy might be one of their finest films, period. I think it's one of the most gorgeously, meticulously crafted films. The use of yellow in the film is just such a powerful color that really just bathes the thing in such a cool, distinct, unique Denis Villeneuve style that makes it feel so wholly himself, and really like an altruistic piece of work.
What's wrong? You're crazy.
I'm crazy!
Speaking of altruistic, let's move on to the next film, which is Under the Skin by Jonathan Glazer. This is about a woman who prowls the streets of Glasgow, and she kind of finds these unsuspecting men who kind of fall under her spell. That's kind of the description that Letterboxd gives. I'm just reading it right now. Very interesting. There's some twists. I don't even know if it's a twist or not. I guess spoiler alert in 3, 2, 1. She's really an alien, which is a really cool idea and a really cool concept. The problem I have with a lot of these A24 films, at least the really, really early ones, and I guess some nowadays, is that the ideas are always so interesting and so good. And I think the themes are very fascinating, but sometimes it just doesn't click. And I think something could be really interesting in theory and in concept, but when you watch it for 90 minutes, sometimes it loses its power. And I think Under the Skin is something that might have been really good as like a short film. But then again, I look at who the director is and I see it's Jonathan Glazer. And Jonathan Glazer just made a very interesting, controversial, very abstract experimental film recently that won an Oscar, which is The Zone of Interest. It won 2 Oscars actually. But it is one of those films that also when I saw it for the first time, I was like, I don't really I mean, I understand it and I get what he's saying and I love what he's doing and the idea and the concept, but do I actually enjoy watching this? Like, is this something I want to sit with again and actually like dissect? And then the second time I watched The Zone of Interest, it was like night and day. It was like one of the best films of that year. After I rewatched it, I was like, yeah, that's the best film after Oppenheimer to be nominated for Best Picture last year. And I feel like Under the Skin has the potential to be that for me, where I rewatch it and I'm like, oh, okay, this is the genius that Jonathan Glazer was bringing to us, because the images are all gorgeous. I mean, you look at every single frame of this thing and there's something to say. There's always something to find that is very touching and moving and powerful about the way others perceive us, the way we perceive ourselves. Like what would happen if an alien came and kind of observed us with their own eyes, but disguised as a stranger, as a human, what that says about our world and our society and our culture. I really like the idea of it, but I just couldn't really get into it. But Jonathan Glazer, of all the filmmakers that have made movies in this slate of A24 year two films, is someone who I think with time I find even more appreciation for his film. Sexy Beast, another great film he's done. So I really do think there's potential for me to love his work more and more if I dig a little deeper and rewatch them and really give them the full, you know, open mindedness that they require. So I do recommend it, even though it's not my personal thing.
You don't want to wake up, do you?
Another film that I feel like just has such a good idea, but a very poor execution. Or, you know what? I shouldn't say poor execution, but it's executed as well as it can be, I guess, but it just doesn't necessarily lend itself for a full length film, which is Locke, directed by Stephen Knight. This is about a guy, Ivan Locke, who is driving in a car, and he spends the entire film driving in a car and taking these phone calls from his wife and kid at home, and also from this woman that he presumably knocked up, who is now pregnant and having his baby, and how he kind of struggles with that emotional, balance right there of, what do I say? What do I keep secret? And he is a very big open book in this film, which is very interesting. He kind of comes out the gate telling his wife, like, listen, this happened and this is where I'm going. And you kind of see how his life essentially falls apart in the span of an hour and a half, which, like, again, the idea for it is so good, and there are people who love this movie, so I think I am in the minority of it. But I think there's only so much you can do about a guy sitting in his car. I think it's a great concept. If you were to like pitch this movie, I think this is the one of the pitches of this slate that you could easily say like, yep, we're greenlighting that, because it's just a guy getting all these phone calls. You kind of can make up all the conversations in your head of what it would look like if they were in face to face with one another. But I think there's that added tension of like trying to stay awake at the wheel. It's late at night. The atmosphere of that. It's a little rainy, or at least the sidewalks are, have that little bit of a glow to them. The pavement, and then what that does to someone when they're in a confined space as well. It's a very claustrophobic film, and I almost wish the camera stayed still at times because there's a lot of cutting because they want to try to make it as cinematic as possible. But I almost would have liked it if the camera just stayed on him. I think it would have even added more to the claustrophobic feel. But again, I think all the performances are great. There's obviously some great vocal performances. A young Tom Holland. You have Olivia Colman, Andrew Scott, Ruth Wilson, and of course, Tom Hardy, who you do see throughout the film, who is very, very good. It's just one of those things where, again, like, I feel like this could have been a really good, like, 40-minute short where I feel like it would have really gotten its point across and it wouldn't have felt like a chore to watch. Whereas here, it's only 85 minutes, but it feels like you're going on a long distance car ride watching this and following along. It honestly might have made a good, like, radio play where you can just, like, listen to it, listen to the story and the conversations. I really just think when you're sitting at a screen watching something for an hour and a half, which is still a long time for a single kind of location, single concept. But that's why we love A24, because they take those risks. And even though the risk for me didn't really pay off, I got bored by the end of it. I certainly felt the length. I certainly appreciate it for what it is. And it really is just a really good concept. And I think that's the thing A24 does best, is they put their money towards the ideas and the people that they think can really bring it to life. Even if the product isn't stellar, they're not losing as much because they're putting enough of a budget without going over budget too, which is just a very interesting business strategy, and that's why A24 has made a name for itself. And it is quite obviously one of the greatest studios in the game. Speaking of obvious, let's talk about Obvious Child. This is a Jenny Slate vehicle directed by Gillian Robespierre. I really like Jenny Slate. I think she's hilarious, and I haven't seen her really command a film like this. I mean, Marcel the Shell, which she was on, is one of my favorite animated films the last few years, but she's a voice actress in that, so like you don't get to see her in her full force. Here she is just front and center, and she's so charismatic. Her comedy at times is borderline cringe, but because it's endearing, because she's endearing, it's just the perfect blend of like awkward and quirky, but also like really funny.
Very nice close friend who's such a nice person decided to sleep with my boyfriend. I would love to just murder suicide them.
She's just a naturally very funny person, so I'm just gravitated toward her in this film. She plays a comedian. She like quite literally is kind of in an autobiographical sense playing this comic, but it more centers around her when she gets pregnant from this one night stand and how she navigates getting an abortion. And I think that's a really interesting concept, because it shows that people who put on this happy face and go out and do comedy, they sometimes have these layers of stuff they're dealing with at home deeply kind of hidden beneath that artifice. And I love how the comedy in this film, the stand-up comedy scenes, kind of show her as she kind of struggles with all the emotions of what is going on, and how she uses comedy and art in essentially as a grander theme, like just art in general, to kind of aid her emotions and get her talking about her emotions, and essentially aiding as her own therapy, which I think is really cool. But just what it has to say about abortion in general, the positivity, especially now of any year, that this was a very critical conversation. I think a lot of people could benefit from watching this film and seeing the humanity and the empathy on display here in regards to just abortion and pro-choice. I love the romance in this thing. The romance is also very awkward, very quirky, but again, it makes sense, and it makes sense for the tone of the story, but it also makes sense in what the message they're trying to get across is in terms of that pro-choice messaging, and how the relationship itself continues to grow either together or apart. I won't tell you, based on the decisions that she makes, because it is her decision. And I love that. But aside from what it stands for, it's just very entertaining.
Never peed in public before? Oh, did you just fart in my face?
No. Yeah, I think it only gets better in its third act, which I think cannot be said about a lot of these films. I think a lot of these films lose steam at the end, whereas Obvious Child kind of gets even better at the end. So I really, really do recommend Obvious Child.
Not the angel on top. I'm the menorah on top of the tree that burns it down.
Next up, we have The Rover by director David Michôds. This is about two guys who are kind of like going through this like wasteland. It's almost like apocalyptic, like it's an Australian film. They're going through the Australian outback, but it's clear that this is set in like some sort of near but distant future at the same time. It's almost kind of like a very low budget, low energy Mad Max, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, I think. Or Mad Max Fury Road. I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing when you sell it as that. When you say like, oh, this is like Mad Max Fury Road light, it's like you expect there to be a lot more action, but I really do want to emphasize the light aspect of it, because it really isn't action. It's more about the character. It's more about the drama of these two guys, where some guy's car is stolen, I believe, and he's trying to pursue him, and then his brother is along for the ride, and kind of that dynamic and how it shifts. The lead of the film is Guy Ritchie, and he's great, but the real standout here is Robert Pattinson in a supporting role.
You should never stop thinking about a life you've taken. What's the price you pay for taking it?
I'm still in control here.
This is another film that I feel like got better in the third act. I actually wasn't vibing with it. I think I had heard so many comparisons comparing it to Mad Max Fury Road that I was expecting something a little bit more energetic, but it really is a lethargic film. And I think it really feels it in those first two acts. But in the third act, I think it all comes together in a very satisfying way, to where I left the film enjoying myself more than I was in the first two acts. So I think that's always a plus for a film when it can leave you on a high rather than the vice versa, where it starts on a high and you leave in a kind of crummy state, kind of like with Locke, where I was like really vibing with it and I was like, all right, this is going on too long. Here I was like, okay, this makes sense. I like this a lot more now at the end, especially at the end with Robert Pattinson's performance. It is his first big performance, I believe, post Twilight. I think it's his first performance post Twilight, and I think without the Rover, we don't get our good time performance from Robert Pattinson. We might not even get the Batman. Like this really kind of set him in motion to have these really cool, meaty, dramatic roles that aren't married to this YA material. Again, if you are going in expecting Mad Max Fury Road, you're not going to get that. I see the similarities, but I think they're really kind of mismarketing it in that sense. It is its own unique thing and it is its own special unique thing. It's not my favorite, but I could at least appreciate it for what it was.
The only thing that means anything right now is that I'm here. And he's not.
Next, we have Life After Beth by Jeff Baena. This is just such a fun Aubrey Plaza vehicle. She is one of the greatest actresses working of our generation. She has such versatility despite kind of getting pigeonholed in a specific type. Here, it kind of lets her play to her type, but also kind of go outside the box.
Okay, fine. What do you want to eat?
I don't know. What do you want to eat?
What, you think you even want to eat food?
It's about this guy who's devastated about the death. It's an unexpected death of his girlfriend, Beth, and
I'm a mess, Mr. Slocum. There's just like so many things that I wish I had told her.
In the first 20 minutes, it's all about him and the family kind of reconnecting over her passing, which is actually, I hate to say it, kind of the most charming stuff in the movie. Not to say that it kind of goes off the rails by the end, but this is one of those examples of a movie that starts really strong and I feel like ends in a not so great place. The premise, though, is really interesting, where Beth just magically reappears in their lives, and the parents are like, we don't know what happened, but we got to keep it under wraps because everyone thinks she's dead, and the boyfriend's freaking out. He's like, I don't know what's going on.
She's resurrected. Resurrected.
Okay, and that's better. Why? Why is that better?
It's from the Old Testament.
Why's all my stuff in boxes now?
And Aubrey Plaza then starts to reveal all these layers to Beth on why is she back? Is she a zombie? Is she a, another mystical? She's a zombie. I'll just tell you right now. She is like an undead person, which I think is just so fun. It is.
Okay, it's not fun. It's weird. End of kiss, guys.
It's just one of the most fun concepts of any of these A24 films. I think you either get like the really serious, like dreary, dark A24, you get the really experimental, heady, enemy under the skin type A24, and then you get this, which is just like silly, weird, nasty humor, which I really like. And I think Life After Beth is a really good vehicle for that. But it is mostly about the performance. I think you watch this for Aubrey Plaza's performance, even for Dane DeHaan's performance, who a lot of people have been really critical of Dane DeHaan and a lot of his roles, especially in 2014 with this and the Green Goblin and stuff. But I really think he does a good job. I think he does the job that this film requires really well. Again, I don't really like it as much by the end of it as I do in the beginning. The beginning, I think, is really actually really poignant in what it has to say about death and how we relate to others through death, especially when like you're talking to the parents of someone you loved, and what that does for like a young person grieving. But ultimately, it's still a fun time, and I really enjoyed it.
You ate a guy.
Oh, what do you want from me, Zach? I'm a zombie. Zombies eat guys.
Next up, a film I really, really wanted to love, and so many people have said like it's underrated, it's actually pretty good, and then like a few people have been like, no, it's the worst thing ever. And I actually hate to say I lean toward the worst thing ever conversation for this one. It is Tusk by Kevin Smith. I really, really wanted to like this, and for a little while, I was like getting glimpses, and I was like, you know what, this is going to be like this really cool, weird, quirky, out there bananas, because I've seen the image of the walrus. I knew what was coming. I knew what was the film was leading to, but
He wants to turn me into an animal or something.
I was like, all right, we're gonna get there. And they shows him like the bone of the walrus dick, and I'm like, all right, this is funny. And then
The walrus is far more evolved than any man I've heard of, present company included.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
like, there's this scene where the guy gets drugged, and you're like, okay, I see where this is going. And then it just goes off the rails. I think the problem with this film is that the central plot of this guy basically being drugged and then being turned into a walrus is absurd, but still kind of works on its own. The problem is this like B plot that they have where they bring in Johnny Depp as a character and they have to go find their friend who has been kidnapped. And the two characters that we're following are very unlikable because they're essentially cheating on this guy and also the kind of homewrecker best friend who's also cheating on. I'm spoiling a lot of things because I don't really recommend you go see this one. But if you have seen it and you really like it, let me know in the comments why, because I do think there's something to be said about the absurdism of Kevin Smith's work like this. And I would really like to know a lot more behind the scenes on how this got made and why this got made, because I've heard there's some very interesting stories. But again, I think it's another interesting premise that just doesn't really work in execution. I think the makeup is actually really good. I think if I were to nominate it for something, for example, in like an A24 awards, I think this is one of the better makeup jobs of any A24 film. But again, I think your mileage really does vary depending on what your sense of comedy is, what you find funny versus not find funny. I actually found this to be a successful comedy at times, but ultimately some of these scenes just are funny, and then they keep going and keep going and keep going, and it feels like these scenes have been going on for 20 minutes and then they're not funny anymore. And I think that's the thing, is like, it's not that they're not funny jokes, it's just that the jokes kind of overstay their welcome, if that makes sense. And I really like Kevin Smith, so I hope this is only a fluke, because I still need to see a few more of his works. But I think from what I've seen, this is the only one I really don't love of his, so that's a good sign. I think he's still batting, above 500 when it comes to his batting average as a filmmaker. Not that filmmaking and baseball is the same thing, but next up is Laggies by Lynn Shelton. This is actually one I had seen before. This one and Enemy are the only two that I had actually seen before. So a lot of these were first watches, but Laggies is one that I remember watching when Lynn Shelton passed. It was very sad. She had a very sudden and unexpected passing, from what I believe. And I watched this movie and I thought it was very charming. I thought it was a very charming coming of age film. And then I rewatched it. And I think having followed, watching Tusk, because I watched these in order, like watching The Rover, which I thought was pretty slow, Life of After Beth, which kind of ended pretty slow, Tusk, The Walrus, and then watching Laggies was just really a breath of fresh air. And I think one of the more underrated elements of A24's filmography is the coming of age kind of young teen comedy. But this is very interesting because it's not a coming of age story about a girl, like a teen. It's more of a grown woman, and she leaves her best friend's wedding and goes to a liquor store, and then these kids approach her and they're like, hey, can you buy us a bottle of liquor? And she does. And
Oh, forgot our IDs. Would you buy a six-pack or something?
Someone did this for me when I was your age. It's like a rite of passage, right?
I had a good feeling about you.
And she actually becomes friends with this 16-year-old girl. And it's a little weird at first. It's this 28-year-old hanging out with the 16-year-old or 14-year-old, however old she is. But then through meeting this younger person, she starts to realize what her life means to her as an older person now. And she then is able to imbue her own wisdom on this young girl. And I like how all the drama that ensues, and the romantic drama, I guess, because there is a lot of romance in this thing, is all between consenting adults and not the adults and the children. The adults and the children is merely, I think, a kind of device to get to the other stuff. But I will say, I really think Laggies is a very smart coming of age film, because it kind of covers a period of age that isn't covered as much in this genre. It kind of covers beyond the coming of age. What is the second coming of age, and what does that mean when you're in that kind of limbo between all right, I'm out of college, I have a job, but I'm not quite married with kids, and what does that kind of limbo in between mean for those who want that? And there's also people who don't want that, and I think that's also really interesting. And what Laggies also brings to the conversation is what is the perfect lifestyle? Who are the friends you want to surround yourself with, and why can't we just have fresh new starts? And what do fresh new starts mean? What do we take with us versus leave behind? It's just one of those very fitting films that can kind of tackle any corner of the existential crisis you may have at any part of midlife crisis or quarter age crisis you may have. So yeah, Laggies is just a really sweet film, really well written, well acted. Sam Rockwell's great in it. Keira Knightley plays the lead woman, and Chloe Grace Moretz plays the kid that she befriends. And I love their friendship, and I love their roles and their characters and their performances. It's a little weird to hear Keira Knightley not do a British accent.
I'm going to tell you something that I've gotten some perspective on recently. You can't keep putting aside what you want for some imaginary future.
But hey, there's always a fun first time for everything.
Hey, did you hear the one about the grown woman who started hanging out with a bunch of pubescent kids?
No, what?
No, I'd never heard of it before either.
Next up, one of the more puzzling A24 films, which is Revenge of the Green Dragons. Now, these directors, Andrew Lau Wei Kung and Andrew Liu, are actually the guys who made Infernal Affairs, which later got adapted, of course, into The Departed. And funny enough, Martin Scorsese is actually a producer on this film. So I went into it, I was like, all right, the guys who made the original inspiration behind The Departed, produced by the guy who did The Departed, this is going to be a slam dunk. And it ended up being one of the more disappointing films of the slate. It's boring. I think the action is excessive, but doesn't really have anything to say. The characters are flat. The script is pretty flat. I couldn't even really tell you much of the story.
I don't know of any umbrella that's going to keep the city dry.
It really is just like this immigrant story with a lot of fighting. There's just a lot of fighting. It's the 70s, kind of turning into the 80s. It's in New York. Like, I can think of what it is, but not like why it is and how it is, if that makes sense. Like, I can give you the very base level structure of what it looks like and what like the characters do. They fight each other a lot. There's a lot of violence, there's a lot of gore, there's a lot of excessive violence, but I couldn't really tell you much about these characters' personalities. I couldn't tell you the arcs they go on, the journeys they go on. This is the one that I think, if I look back after watching all these A24 films over the next like 3, 4, or 5 years, however many it takes to catch up to this project, I'm going to look back on this one specifically and go, wait, what was that one again? Then I'll be like, oh, it's a Scorsese produced one? Weird. Why is that so not memorable? And I really think the worst films are not those that are so bad that we keep talking about how bad they are, but the worst ones are the ones that are so unmemorable that we're not even talking about them. And I think there's something to be said about that versus something like Tusk, which I think is a worse film probably, but one at least that I think I'm more likely to talk about, whereas this one I'm probably not.
Bring us here.
It's what this country's built on. The American dream.
Next, moving on, we have The Captive, starring Ryan Reynolds, directed by Adam Egoyan, from 2014, obviously, 10 years later. It's really interesting, especially with like Deadpool coming out this week, or Deadpool 3, and Ryan Reynolds kind of being this known for comedy and snark, and everything is very like witty and Ryan Reynolds. And then seeing him play this like grieving father who lost his daughter.
Yes?
If Wolverine's version of this is Prisoners with Hugh Jackman, this is kind of Deadpool's version with Ryan Reynolds playing a very similar role that Hugh Jackman played in Prisoners, where it's like this kind of father who's upset because his daughter's abducted and he kind of acts out. It's very interesting how this film is edited. It's edited in a non-linear way. So like sometimes you'll be in like the present where the daughter is fully grown and still, being held captive, and the father has also aged, but because it's Ryan Reynolds, he really doesn't look like he's aged, so it's kind of confusing. And it's also all set during winter, so it's really not, you're really having a tough time distinguishing, wait, is this past, is this present? And luckily, because the girl actually ages, it's easier to tell what kind of time period we're in. But if we're not on her, if we're on like Ryan Reynolds stuff, it almost takes us a second to be like, wait, is this past, present, is this future? And then, it kind of cuts back and forth to that first, initial time when she was abducted and how he acted, especially how the police questioned him, because he was the last one to see her. Is this really an abduction? Was this girl kidnapped? Or was this guy, this dad, trying to like get away with a murder or a very tragic circumstance or something? And I think this film actually would have been one of the top highlights of this retrospective if it had a linear storytelling. And I really like non-linear storytelling. I think it's a really cool device when like directors like Christopher Nolan do it, and other directors. But I think for this film, because of the story it's telling, I don't necessarily know if it needed a lot non-linear storytelling. And this could just be personal opinion, but I really think if we had just seen the events kind of accumulate and build to the climax in their own natural way, I think it would have left us, with a little bit more suspense. But when you're cutting back and forth, it's like, okay, so we know that the daughter's at least alive and well, not well, obviously, because she's being held captive, but she's at least alive. Like, there's not even that intrigue. Whereas like something like Prisoners, we truly don't know what happened to these girls, and we are watching and kind of experiencing it with the father. Whereas here, it's like we know what happens to her. It's about trying to wait and see how they find her and how they get her back. And I think there's something interesting to be said about that. But I think if you want to really build the suspense and really hammer home the drama and tension of this thing, I would have liked to see it in just a linear way. Whereas when it's non-linear, I feel like some of the, effect is a little lost. It's still an effective film and it's still a powerful film. And I think Ryan Reynolds playing this dramatic role is really, really nice because he does so much comedy. It's so nice to see him just like be something different.
They've taken my daughter. I need to know right now, what are you doing to help?
That's why I also really like Mississippi Grind, which we'll cover next year when we talk about A24 in year 3. But I just love to see Ryan Reynolds do something different. And that is why I think this film shines, even though I think it's a little poorly structured in the way it's edited. These people have my daughter. But lastly, we have A Most Violent Year by J.C. Chandor. This is a thriller set in New York City during one of the most violent years in the city's history. But I'll tell you right now, not a lot of violence in this film. And I get that might have been the point. It's like, this is the most violent year, but this is really what's going on. But I don't know, for a film that advertises itself with like this darkness. I mean, the poster is very crisp and dark and has the Shadow and Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain. Everything's very serious and dark and deep. And I feel like this film is very serious and dark and deep, but also very boring. It's the most boring year, if I'm honest. And I'm not going to take credit for that. A lot of people's Letterboxd reviews said this, a most boring year, because that really is it. I think when you go into a film that's called like the most violent year, it kind of sets an expectation. You know, you don't really know what it is, but you know there's going to be an intrigue and a mystery, and there is a little bit of it, but really it's just a lot of guys and conversations talking, you know, a few shootouts here and there, a few, you know, tense standoffs, some manipulative power plays and stuff, some great acting and some pretty solid writing. That's the thing, is like the screenplay is solid, it's just not a very interesting story, but the way it's written is fine. I mean, it's coherent. I think the dialogue is fine. I think Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain give great performances. It's a bit weird because this is the film that like came out at the end of the year. I believe it came out like New Year's Eve in 2014, because a lot of people were thinking this was going to be a big Oscar push, and this really was hyped up to be one of the potentials for Oscars, but I can see why it wasn't, because it just kind of falls flat, and especially when you get your hopes up of this being this big prestige picture, because at the time A24 wasn't making these big Oscar-y films yet. Their first big Oscar film would come next year with Room, so I think there's something to be said about like the expectation of society going into seeing this movie. And I remember it being hyped up and then the reviews being like, that was all right. And then it ended up being like American Sniper that got the nomination instead for like that late year slot for the Oscars. So I was really excited to I was excited and looking forward to this one, but I watched it and it was just kind of, you know, and that's kind of again what I was saying with the Revenge of the Green Dragons. It's like the worst films are the ones that were just kind of like on, you know. I'd rather at least have a very strong opinion about something being bad than just have really no opinion at all. And A Most Violent Year was kind of a more boring way to end this watch through.
And telling the truth.
But that is all 11 films. So I am going to rank these just because I ranked them last time at the bottom, just because I do think it is just the worst film. I think it's probably the most poorly constructed. The scenes go on too long. It's just uncomfortable at times. Tusk, just not my type of movie. I wish it was. There are moments that are, but altogether it doesn't come together. But then I'm going to put Revenge of the Green Dragons and A Most Violent Year, because again, the worst type of films are the ones that you really can't talk much about because they just leave very, very little impact on you. Number 8, I'm going to put Locke. Again, a great idea, but in my opinion, just an overlong execution. Probably should have been a short film. Number 7, I have The Rover. Again, started so slow, but ended good. So that's what puts it above Locke. And then at number 6, I'll put Under the Skin, straight in the middle, just because I think it's one that on rewatch I really appreciate a lot more. But right now, it's purely about the vibes and the experimentation. So I can't quite say I'm 100% hooked yet. But Jonathan Glazer has a way to get me back around on his films. Number 5, Life After Beth. It was fun enough, funny enough. I think this is like one of the more light films of the slate, probably the lightest if you're looking for something that's not too heavy. And oddly enough, it's like about death in the beginning, like first 20 minutes. So it's impressive that it's able to still be one of the lighter films of the slate. At number 4, probably the heaviest film of the slate, which is The Captive. But I did think at least the performances and the characters and the story itself was engaging. I just wish it wasn't told in a non-linear way, because I think that detracted from the power of the message. At number 3, Laggies. This is one that I'd seen before and I liked even better on a second watch. Rest in peace, Lynn Shelton. You are amazing. At number 2, Obvious Child. Really surprising. Didn't really have this on my radar. Now I'm going to be watching this film often. I think it's really solid. Jenny Slate giving one of the better performances by actresses in 2014. And then number 1, just a film I watch time and time again because I think it's so interesting. And every time I think I'm going to be bored by it, I end up getting even more intrigued by it because these twists just keep on twisting. It is Enemy at my number 1. So that is my ranking for the 11 films of A24 Year 2. If you've seen these films, let me know down below. If you haven't, they're all on Cinemax. If you have Cinemax, remember Cinemax? It exists, and they're all on there. So go check those out. They're really, really interesting films, even if they're not great all the way through. Some of them are at least interesting. I'd watch a bunch of these again. I think it's not quite hitting the stride yet that A24 would eventually hit. But again, because you have more films, you have more room for error, but you also have more room for success. And while the last slate, I think, had like 2 really heavy hitters with Spring Breakers and The Spectacular, now this one has one big heavy hitter for me with Enemy, and then a bunch of other like pretty good films, borderline okay films, and then a few that I don't care for. So again, I would probably put year 1 above year 2, but it's only because they had less of a pool to fail, whereas this one has a bigger pool to fail. But again, A24 one of the most interesting studios, so I can't wait to see how they grow in year 3 next year. But that was the retrospective on A24 year 2. If you like this review, like it. Actually like it. There's a button right down there. Just like it. Give me that thumbs up, and I will pay you back in gratitude by thanking you in the next video. And if that next video is out, go check out those videos. Check out all the videos here on the Dill Pickle Movie Network, and make sure to comment. Make sure to subscribe so you can check out all those videos. And let me know, of course, what you thought of this one. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.